Sunday School teacher, I'm glad that you've joined us for our time of study and preparation. I'm Tim Smith with Sunday School University, and we are working on the lesson for Sunday, March the 30th. The title of this lesson, again, we're in 1 Peter. We're going to be in chapter 3, first part of chapter 3, first 12 verses. The title of this lesson is Our Relationships. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. The point of the lesson is this: believers live out their faith in the context of relationships. In this verses that we're going to look at, Peter deals with the sensitive issue of Christian relationships. As I said earlier, believers live out our lives in the context of relationships. He specifically focuses on the relationship between husbands and wives, and particularly the different roles that they have in the marriage relationship. He addresses the role of the husband as the leader in the marriage and the necessary submission of the wife to her husband. Both are undertaken in the spirit of love for one another and God. So, here we go. We get 6 verses for the wives and 1 verse for the husband. Yes, everybody's going to be mad about that. But let's look at them and discuss them and see what the Lord's Word says to us. So he begins with the wives in verses 1 through 6. In the same way, what's he talking about? He's talking about he talks about submission at the end of chapter 2. He talks about the relationship of slaves to masters. So in the same way, wives, submit yourselves to your own husband, so that even if some disobey the word, they might be won over without a word by the way their wives live, when they observe your pure and reverent lives. Don't let your beauty consist of outward things like elaborate hairstyles or the wearing of gold jewelry, but rather what is inside the heart, the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For in the past, the holy women who put their hope in God also adorned themselves in this way, submitting to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed everything, calling him Lord. You have become her children when you do what is good and do not fear any intimidation. So here in these verses, Peter addresses the relationship of wives. He says in verses 1 and 2 that Peter calls them to submit to their husbands. In the same way is a general sense, like slaves and masters. And remember in chapter 2, he dealt also with the role of citizens and rulers. So he's dealing with the issue of submission. This is a voluntary submission for the purpose of being an example to their husbands. The issue at stake in the call for wives to submit to their husbands is not the issue of equality. The difference in the role or function between husbands and wives does not cancel out equality. We see throughout the New Testament the fact that women are raised up. Jesus himself raised up women. So it's not an issue of equality, it's a difference in roles and responsibilities. in verses 3 and 4, he more clearly defined what pure and reverent living involved. Wives needed to focus on the inner beauty rather than on outward adornment. These verses do not forbid these things. This passage is not saying, okay, you can't wear jewelry and you can't do makeup and you can't fix your hair. That's not what these verses are saying, but it's saying that true beauty is a heart matter. Don't spend all your time fixing out the outside, work on the inside. These terms that he uses here together denote a woman of strong character, of strong self-control, and a lady of dignity. In verse 5, Peter uses the example of holy women from previous generations. These wives submitted to their husbands not because the men were intellectually or morally or spiritually superior to them. Rather, they submitted because they knew that God rewards those who trust and obey Him. In verse 6, Peter uses the example of Abraham and Sarah. It says that Sarah obeyed, that is, to listen to in a sense of being submissive. And he reminds us that Sarah called Abraham Lord. That was a title that expresses great respect and reverence. Wives should not submit to their husbands out of fear or intimidation, but out of an allegiance to God. And again, remember that Peter says you need to submit and you need to live a holy life so that those husbands that don't fear God would be reached by your example. So that's the role of the wives. In verse 7, we see Peter addressing the husbands. He says, husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker partner, showing them honor as co-heirs of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Peter instructed the husbands to treat their wives with wisdom and understanding and to honor them as fellow believers. Husbands are to live with their wives in a way that demonstrates their knowledge of God's will. In other words, husbands, treat your wives, live with your wives, deal with them in a spiritually mature way that you understand God's will. Now, that weaker partner verse, that statement, has caused people to get mad. Well, what's he saying there, weaker partner? He's talking about the physical strength. They have less physical strength than men. We also know that women are in a more vulnerable position in society than husbands, than men. And so we need to understand that yes, we can be physically dominating of women. We can dominate them in our society. And Peter is saying, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't take advantage of them because of your physical strength. Don't take advantage of them because of your position in society. He's saying that husbands are to value their wives. Every believing husband and wife are equal recipient of God's saving grace with all its benefits, both in this age and age to come. Peter reminds us when things are not right at home, it impacts all of our relationships, including our relationship with God. Well, let's look at verses 8 through 12, and there we see our relationship with all believers. Finally, and again, that finally is not there to be a conclusion, but it's the relationships. Finally, all of you be like-minded and sympathetic. Love one another and be compassionate and humble, not paying back evil for evil or insult for insult, but on the contrary, giving a blessing, since you have been called for this, that you may inherit a blessing. For the one who wants to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. And let him turn away from evil and do what is good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. Because the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do what is evil. So here Peter says, okay, what I'm about to say to y'all, I've just talked to you about husbands and wives, and what I'm about to say to you applies to everybody. And that is true of husbands and wives, how we should live, people in general, church folk. Number 8, we are to live in harmony with each other. Christians are to pursue the same primary purposes of spreading the gospel and building up the church in love. He talks about being sympathetic, to care for one another, not only to value our opinions, we are to value each other's feelings, and we are to take care of each other's needs instead of acting selfishly. That's true in the home as well as in the church. Compassion toward others flows out of the mercy and forgiveness that God has extended to us in Jesus Christ. We should love because we're loved. We should forgive and be kind because we've been forgiven, and God is kind. Humility is the accurate understanding of self, the appreciation of others, and the acknowledgement that God is in control. We are to be humble. Well, what does it mean to be humble? To understand ourselves, to appreciate others, and to acknowledge that we're not in control, but God is. That's humility. We are not to, in verse 9, we are not to repay evil with evil or insult with evil, but rather we are to seek peace and do what is good. And here we see in verses 10 through 12, Peter quoting Psalm 34, verses 12 through 16. We are to live life and have good days. All that, love life and good days refers to a life and a blessing in this world. The love life, verse 10, and good days. What it's saying, hey, you want to have a good life, here's what you got to do. Verse 12 or verse 11, a life that is pleasing to God does not simply just happen. It doesn't happen by accident, but it requires constant effort and determination. Let him turn away from evil and do what is good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. He's saying that if you're going to have that kind of life, if you want good things in life, you got to put some effort into it. You got to make right choices. Verse 12, the Lord sees and hears. He knows all, and He hears all. Well, as we teach these verses, number 1, okay, wives are to submit to their husbands and live pure and reverent lives. What if my husband's not a Christian? Submit. But remember what we talked about last week in that thing of submission to rulers. You do so until that ruler asks you to break the law of God, to sin. You do what the husband says unless he is saying sin. Choose me over God. Submit to your husband. So, okay. Number 2, husbands are to honor their wives as fellow believers. All these scriptures that we read about how we're to live in peace with each other in the church and how we're to value each other in the church and how we put others first in the church, well, that's supposed to be true at home. Take care of your wives. Honor them. Value them. Number 3, believers are to demonstrate love, compassion, and humility toward one another. So as we teach this, what are some reasons you get frustrated with people? Well, what frustrates you with people? And then you spend the majority of your time in these verses as we talk about relationships. And then the application. What actions can our group take to strengthen our marriages? What are some ways that we can support those who are not married? And then also the characteristics, the 6 characteristics that Peter uses in verses 8 through 9. Make a list of those characteristics and ask, where are you strongest? And where are you weakest? What's your greatest challenge? How can you improve those characteristics? Well, again, the title of the lesson is Our Relationships. The point is that believers live out their faith in the context of relationships. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this coming Sunday. God bless you.